call your name. Days get long, I call your name. Days get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions. We're looking at Judges chapter 10 through to chapter 12 this evening, and this is session 8. This particular session is going to focus on the story of Jephthah, and as I say, that covers the 3 chapters. I'm certainly going to need my good friend David to help me with this, and in a moment we'll hear something from him. The sections from chapter 10 through to chapter 12, the beginning of chapter 10 and the ending of chapter 12, contain a number of cameos. The first relates to a man called Tola, who appears to have led his people into a time of peace. The second refers to Jair, and we're told a little bit about his donkey-riding sons. Again, it would appear to have been a time of stability and peace. And then towards the end of chapter 12, we're briefly introduced to 3 more cameos. Is Ibzan, who has a remarkable number of children. Some very brief information about Elon, followed by Abdon, who seems to outdo Tola in terms of the number of donkeys that he has. Again, we can only assume that chapter 10 opens with a period of stability and chapter 12 closes with another period of peace and stability. The emphasis in these little cameos seems to be on children, and of course that resonates somewhat with the story of Jephthah. That will become more important as we get into the story about his life. In between the cameos at the beginning of chapter 10 and the ending of chapter 12, we have a period that was anything but peaceful. And there does seem that the narrator, the writer, has some reasons why he's approached it in such a way, the way that he set the story of Jephthah in the midst of these cameo appearances that we have at the beginning of chapter 10 and the end of chapter 12. Firstly, I think the reason why the author has included them is that he wants to remind us that God is active, but beyond that a pattern is beginning to emerge. Gideon's story, if you remember, led on to the violence of his son Abimelech, although he wasn't a son by birth, in the sense of being part of the immediate family of Gideon. And then that follows on with a period of respite. Then you have Jephthah's violence, and then that seems to carry on into another period of respite. That will then lead us into the story of Samson, which, of course, will introduce us to violence upon violence. So the general pattern is one of violence, a period of respite, maybe possibly a period of peace, another period of violence, then a further period of respite into another period of violence. And all the time, I think the author, the writers are trying to remind us, those that were involved in editing the material, that this downward spiral just continues, even if there are very short periods when things seem to be more stable. So let's invite David Suchet to read for us, and he's going to read from Judges chapter 10 through to Judges chapter 12. Thank you very much, David.
Judges chapter 10. After the time of Abimelech, a man of Issachar named Tola, son of Pua, the son of Dodo, rose to save Israel. He lived in Shamir, in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel for 23 years. Then he died and was buried in Shamir. He was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel for 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havoth Jair. When Jair died, he was buried in Canaan. Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. Israel was in great distress. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, "We have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals." The Lord replied, "When the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried to me for help, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you are in trouble." But the Israelites said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now." Then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, and he could bear Israel's misery no longer. When the Ammonites were called to arms and camped in Gilead, the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, "Whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who live in Gilead." Judges chapter 11. Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. "You are not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. Some time later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander, so we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you are in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead." Jephthah answered, "Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head?" The elders of Gilead replied, "The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, "What do you have against me that you have attacked my country?" The king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messengers, "When Israel came up out of Egypt, They took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back, peaceably." Jephthah sent messengers back to the Ammonite king, saying, "This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab, or the land of the Ammonites. But when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness to the Red Sea and on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Give us permission to go through your country.' But the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed at Kadesh. Next they travelled through the wilderness, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab, passed along the eastern side of the country of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. They did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was its border. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and said to him, 'Let us pass through your country to our own place.' Sihon, however, did not trust Israel to pass through his territory. He mustered all his troops and encamped at Jahaz, and fought with Israel. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his whole army into Israel's hand, and they defeated them. Israel took over all the land of the Amorites who lived in that country, capturing all of it from the Arnon to the Jabbok, and from the desert to the Jordan. Now since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people, Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your god Chemosh gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with them? For 300 years Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, the surrounding settlements, and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? I've not wronged you, but you are doing me wrong by waging war against me. Let the Lord, the judge, decide the dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites." The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message Jephthah sent him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me, when I return in triumph from the Ammonites, will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer to the vicinity of Minnith, as far as Abel-keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter! You have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said. And he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Judges chapter 12. The Ephraimite forces were called out, and they crossed over to Zaphon. They said to Jephthah, "Why did you go to fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn down your house over your head." Jephthah answered, "I and my people were engaged in a great struggle with the Ammonites, and although I called, you didn't save me out of their hands. When I saw that you wouldn't help, I took my life in my hands and crossed over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave me victory over them. Now why have you come up today to fight me?" Jephthah then called together the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. The Gileadites struck them down because the Ephraimites had said, "You Gileadites are renegades from Ephraim and Manasseh." The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim. And whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he replied no, they said, "All right, say Shibboleth." If he said Sibboleth, because he could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. Jephthah led Israel for 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died, and was buried in a town in Gilead. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem led Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters. He gave his daughters away in marriage to those outside his clan, and for his sons he brought in 30 young women as wives from outside his clan. Ibzan led Israel for 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem. After him, Elon the Zebulunite led Israel for 10 years. Then Elon died and was buried in Ajalon, in the land of Zebulun. After him, Abdon, son of Hillel, from Pirathon, led Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. He led Israel for 8 years. Then Abdon, son of Hillel, died, and was buried at Pirathon in Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites.
Well, from the outset of the story of Jephthah, a number of themes emerge, probably themes that we've already seen since we've started looking at the way that the book of Judges is structured. Firstly, although this isn't exactly the cycle that we've often had the opportunity to view, it is revisited to some extent. Secondly, the apparent hero of the story is an unlikely person, and that's been the pattern that we've seen emerge so far. Jephthah, we're told, is the son of a prostitute, and later on we see that he was forced into exile by his brothers. The third theme that is emerging is that our apparent hero, our judge, who we would assume would be a savior in that sense for his people, will make a huge mistake, which will lead to further problems. In this case, it will lead to civil war. And fourthly, the whole theme of, which I guess can be captured in a question, how much more will God put up with? Things are just getting worse and worse. The tribes that loosely make up the covenant community find more and more gods to worship. In other words, the covenant is being trashed. In this particular story, the story of Jephthah, we see that the focus is on the Ammonites. Later on, we see that the focus of the story of Samson is very much on the Philistines. And again, as Jephthah's victory emerges, we see that it's only a partial victory over the surrounding nations. In other words, problems are being stored up for the future. So let's think about the cycle. Well, it's not the perfect cycle, but it certainly exhibits factors out of that particular feature. We see that the people are in a terrible plight once more, and they cry out to God. But this time, unlike the other times we've heard that happening, they're primarily not complaining to God that in some way God has let them down, that he's not kept to his covenant promises. This time, their crying out to God involves much more of a confession. Well, on the surface, you would think that's a step forward. But I think as the story unfolds throughout the book of Judges, we see that that isn't actually the case. So how will God respond to all of this? Well, first, if you read Judges chapter 10 and verse 13, it almost seems as if God's had enough. He's finished with them. It's almost as if he's saying, I can't take this any longer. My life is diminished by your consistent unfaithfulness, the way you breach your covenant promises so easily. God seems to be exasperated. And maybe that's a classic example of a response that God makes, which for us is translated into human terms so we can understand the sheer desperation of the situation. But when they set out, the people, to act on their confession, and they begin to clear out some of those foreign gods, it's almost as if God says, I've got to save you. I can't bear this. I couldn't bear not to come to your aid. Maybe that's the moment when we view, or the author wants us to view, God returning to his default position, which of course is always mercy and grace. Even when sin is repetitive, even when the cycle seems to be carried through time and time again. All of that raises a question for us. And of course, the question is this: does God keep changing his mind, or is he adapting to human response? Well, personally, and I'd be interested to know what you think, I think it's the latter. I think God adapts to human response. Israel, represented here at this time by these loosely knitted tribes, shouldn't really have survived. But they did survive. And of course, all of that was down to God. So from the outset of the story of Jephthah, the one thing that we increasingly become aware of, at least initially, is that Jephthah was a very skilled negotiator, both domestically amongst his own people, but internationally with the wider international community. He seems to get the best deal possible out of those same people who had forced him into exile. And they are the ones, ironically, who plead for him and this mercenaries group, this group of brigands, if we could describe them as that, to come and fight, to defend them, to act on their part. Well, of course, Jephthah sees his opportunity, and he's willing to negotiate quite firmly. He says, unless you make me head, ruler over you, I won't come and fight. And then again, later on, once he has sealed that particular agreement, he talks directly to the Ammonites. He corrects their assumptions that the tribes in some way had taken over their land during the exile. The argument that he brings is, it was never your land in the first place. but now I'm offering you a way out of this situation. They will, of course, refuse. In verse 24 of chapter 11, you get a reference to the Moabite god, Shemosh. And the link that's being made here is with 2 Kings chapter 3 and verses 26 to 27, where the king of the Moabites sacrifices his firstborn son. And all of that, the author is using to prepare us for what's going to happen, which is the most awful, the most dreadful thing imaginable. What we might describe as a shocking act. It's interesting to note that even though Jephthah is filled with the Spirit, the story shows us that that doesn't mean that the most terrible mistakes won't be made. We see that with Jephthah. We will certainly see it with Samson when we come to his story. What was Jephthah thinking of? Firstly, he tries to bribe God by saying, the first thing that I see following my victory will be given over to you. Well, on the surface, that might have seemed a wonderful vow to make. But when you think about it, to not have anticipated that the first person to greet him after victory might be a woman, because that was the tradition. When the men returned from fighting, the women would emerge from the home and they would celebrate with instruments and music and songs that were made up almost on the spot, proclaiming the great victories of the men of their particular tribe. Why wouldn't amongst that be that the first person that emerges proved to be his daughter? How stupid he is, how thoughtless he is, as well as unfaithful in the way that he tries to bribe God, to win God onto his side. And of course, he's about to face the most terrible consequence. And as the story unfolds, there seems to be a sense of purity and almost holiness about the way his daughter responds. She seems to accept his decision. She comes across as so innocent. And I think that makes the whole thing seem so much more worse. And yet, in the midst of all of that, Jephthah has a go at saying, well, you're the cause of my problem now. It's almost as if he's saying it's your fault, not mine. All of that is, of course, beyond shameful. Some scholars argue that they admire Jephthah for keeping his oath before God. Let me say that nothing can justify this action. And the outcome of this action is that things are going to get worse and worse. It's worth observing that up to this point, the role of women in the book of Judges has been that they've been set up often as the heroes of the story. I'm avoiding using the word heroine this morning because simply I'm being told that the word hero now applies to both genders. Well, from this point onwards, women will become the innocent victims of the terrible actions of men. And certainly we see that so vividly in these dark moments. One writer described it as a text of horror, and it is a horror-filled passage within what will prove to be a book of horrors as we move forward into it. Others have tried to connect this moment, this sacrifice, with Abraham and Isaac. And some have even linked it in with God giving his son Jesus. Because, of course, this was his only daughter, as in the only son motif. But Jephthah is no Abraham, and he's certainly not God. This isn't typology. This is horrible, the worst outcome possible. Following this, not surprisingly, the story dips once more. The Ephraimites, who seem to be building up a reputation of not being involved in battles, but still wanting to complain about the fact they've not been involved. Well, at this point, Jephthah's negotiating skills completely go AWOL, and he slaughters 42,000 of his own people, the tribes that make up this emerging nation of Israel. And of course, what we see here now is civil war. And the consequences of these actions will live on. They will roll down the centuries. These moments will not be forgotten. We're told towards the end of this story of Jephthah that his reign is very short-lived. And the situation that he leaves behind him is much worse than when he started. So for those of you who are familiar with Hebrews chapter 11 and those great heroes and heroes of the faith, I hear you cry out, how come Jephthah is listed there? Well, I think that's a really good question. And I guess what we see there is alongside Jephthah's many, many failings, at moments, he did act in faith, and he did overcome God's enemies at the time. Those heroes and heroines of chapter 11 of Hebrews are not there because they're perfect, that they didn't make mistakes. In Jephthah's case, huge mistakes. They're there simply because there were moments when they acted in faith. And the writer to the Hebrews wants us to remember that in the midst of the horror of all that we find in chapter 10 through to chapter 12.
Chains get broken, set my body free. Oh, Lord, remember me, remember me. Oh, Lord, remember me.